Today we've got part 2 of our 2-part series where we compared Canon 7D Mark II with the 1D Mark IV. In the first video we looked at things like build quality, controls, ergonomics, and in this video we're going to be looking at key elements of the camera's performance. Autofocus, image quality are going to be some of those things. Both these cameras have really good autofocus performance. The 7D Mark II's got 65 focus points, so it's got a greater number of focus points. The focus points are also cross-type at 5.6, which basically means that even with a lens that has a maximum aperture of 5.6, all 65 of those focus points on the 7D Mark II will still function with a higher level of accuracy than lesser performing focus points. The 1D Mark IV has a 45-point autofocus system, with 39 of those being cross-type if you have a 2.8 lens fitted. So in order to get the majority of focus points to enjoy the benefit of cross-type accuracy, you need a 2.8 lens on the 1D Mark IV. But the comparison in the real world is not as straightforward as that. I've found that despite the specifications, the 1D Mark IV was a camera that had and still has very good autofocus. Out in the field, using the two cameras, I'm equally confident that the autofocus is going to do pretty much as good as any other Canon camera out there, except maybe for the 1DX or the 1DX Mark II. But aside from those two cameras, 7D Mark II, 1D Mark IV, autofocus with a single point is pretty much good enough for almost anything that I might be trying to photograph. Where the 7D Mark II really does stand ahead is in how easy and how broadly you can configure the autofocus options. So on the 7D Mark II, switching from using a single focus point to a cluster is as simple as just pulling down the lever that sits above the autofocus multi-controller. Alternatively, you can change by pushing the MFN button above the shutter. On the 1D Mark IV, if you want to switch from a single point to anything other than all 45 points, you're forced to go back into the camera's menu system. So that's quite a time-consuming sort of way of working. I've also found with the 1D Mark IV that once I go beyond a single focus point, I found that the focus system slows up slightly. So I prefer to shoot it just with a single focus point to get the best results out of it. On both cameras, I would consider autofocus to be a strong point. When it comes to using these cameras in live view or for video, again, the 7D Mark II is clearly standing ahead of the older 1D Mark IV. 7D Mark II is a very easy camera to engage live view. Simply push the button, which is easy to get to, and if you want to focus, hold the shutter down halfway and it focuses very quickly. The sensor on the 7D Mark II is one of Canon's dual pixel autofocus sensors, so that means that the live view focusing is virtually good enough for use in video, not only for still shots. So I make use of live view on the 7D Mark II for wildlife a lot, especially when I'm in places where I need to be totally quiet, or when I want to get angles that I might not be able to reach by sitting or standing. I can actually hold the camera over the side or up in the air to get a different angle. Live view on the 1D Mark IV is virtually only usable if you are using the camera off a tripod. It focuses very slowly, and any movement on my own part will upset the focusing. And engaging live view is also takes a bit of doing. You need to use the set button on the camera, which can be irritating because if you leave it enabled, it's very easy to bump that button while you're shooting still photos. One of the most important things about any camera's performance, though, is obviously its image quality. So that's quite a complex comparison to make between these two Canon bodies for a number of reasons. One is that the 7D Mark II has what's commonly referred to as a crop sensor. Basically, the sensor is 22 millimeters wide. The 1D Mark IV has a sensor which is 28 millimeters wide, so a significantly larger sensor. 1D Mark IV is still not a full frame camera. A full frame camera would have a sensor that was 35 millimeters wide. So just in as much as the 7D Mark II sensor is smaller than that in the 1D Mark IV, the 1D Mark IV sensor is still smaller than the sensor we would find in a camera like a 1DX or a 5D Mark III. So that larger sensor does give the 1D Mark IV an advantage when it comes to image quality. You're using a larger sensor surface, so that has benefits when it comes to pixel level noise and fine details rendering. But on the other hand, the 7D Mark II has higher resolution, so you can potentially print a 7D Mark II image bigger. It's a 20 megapixel sensor. This is only 16, but consequently, because it's a higher megapixel sensor with a smaller surface area, it becomes a camera that has smaller individual pixels, so that can make it a little less forgiving in terms of how stable you need to be and how still you might need your subject matter to be if you're shooting these two cameras side by side and with the same shutter speeds, ISO settings. So which camera you may prefer when it comes to image quality is going to be subjective. If you're coming to the 7D Mark II from another Canon camera that has small pixel sizes like a 50D or a 7D or a 60D, 550D, 760D, any of those guys coming to the 7D Mark II, you'll be familiar with the kind of image quality that cameras with crop sensors and small pixels deliver, and at the same time 1D Mark IV has an older sensor. The technology is not as advanced as in the sensor in the 7D Mark II, but it has a bigger area, so that counters it to some degree. And again, it's a difficult call for me to make which one you're going to prefer out of the two. They are comparable. I find that the 1D Mark IV image quality is more forgiving in terms of low light, and perhaps a little more forgiving if you wanting to examine the images at 100% magnification, whereas the 7D2 holds a resolution advantage. You can crop it deeper, and if you downsize the images, you end up getting pretty much similar noise levels to the 1D Mark IV. Other things that the 7D Mark II has, which make it a great value these days, it has a pop-up flash, the 1D Mark IV doesn't. A couple of other differences between the cameras: the 7D Mark II has got a built-in GPS. It also has the ability to detect flicker from fluorescent lights and to time the shutter actuations and the metering to compensate for that, which is a huge advantage if you shoot indoors under those under certain kinds of artificial light. When it comes to deciding whether the 7D Mark II will make a better wildlife camera for you over the 1D Mark IV, some of the things that you need to consider are how much more versatile the 7D Mark II is, along with its live view, with the way that you can configure controls and buttons to suit yourself, the way that it gels with Canon's newer cameras like the 5D Mark III, like the 1DX when it comes to menu structures and features. It's definitely a more refined and a more all-rounded camera. If image quality is a concern, then you might need to consider the 1D Mark IV, although the difference is not that big, and it will really depend on your own preferences. I've done a really detailed comparison of the image quality on my website, so you can always head on over there and take a look at the sample images and the comparisons that I've made there. But overall, two pretty good wildlife choices, but for most people the 7D Mark II is going to be the one to go for. Subscribe to this channel if you want to keep getting videos about Canon gear from a wildlife photographer's perspective.